The autumn evening sky had already turned dark when the federal judge finally stepped out of his chambers. His shoulders felt heavy after 12 straight hours of handling complex cases, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he'd served justice to the best of his ability. The courthouse, usually bustling with activity, had fallen silent except for the gentle hum of the cleaning staff's vacuum cleaners and the distant sound of doors closing. As he walked down the marble steps, the judge couldn't help but replay the day's most challenging case in his mind. It had been a difficult custody battle, the kind that reminded him why he'd chosen this path 20 years ago, to make a real difference in people's lives. His polished shoes clicked against the steps, echoing through the empty hallway as he made his way to the parking garage. The black Mercedes, a reward he'd given himself after his 10th year on the bench, sat waiting in his reserved spot. The car wasn't just a symbol of success. It represented countless late nights, difficult decisions, and a commitment to fairness that had earned him respect across the legal community. He placed his worn leather briefcase, heavy with case files he planned to review over the weekend, on the back seat. The drive home started like any other. The streets were quieter now, with only a few cars heading home after late shifts. The judge turned on the radio, keeping the volume low as classical music filled the car. His mind wandered to his son's upcoming law school graduation, a thought that brought a proud smile to his face. Despite all the challenges they'd faced, despite having to have those difficult conversations about how to handle police encounters, his son was following in his footsteps. Street lights cast long shadows as he carefully navigated through the suburban neighborhoods. He always drove exactly at the speed limit here. Experience had taught him that even the smallest mistake could lead to unwanted attention. The houses lining the street were mostly dark now, with only a few windows still glowing with late-night activity. He thought about the dinner waiting at home. His wife had texted earlier about making his favorite pot roast. After 25 years of marriage, she still knew exactly what he needed after a long day. The thought of home, of kicking off his shoes and sharing the day's stories over a warm meal, made the tension in his shoulders ease a bit. The neighborhood he was driving through was beautiful, with its manicured lawns and elegant homes. He'd looked at houses here years ago, but something had held him back. Maybe it was the subtle looks from potential neighbors during house viewings, or the way real estate agents had stumbled over their words when showing him properties. He'd chosen a different neighborhood instead, one where he didn't have to constantly prove he belonged. The dashboard clock showed 9:45 p.m. as he stopped at a red light. He adjusted his tie, slightly loosened after the long day, and checked his rearview mirror, a habit as natural as breathing. That's when he noticed the patrol car that had been following him for the last few blocks. His heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from resignation. Even after 2 decades on the bench, even in his pressed suit and tie, even in his carefully maintained luxury car, some things hadn't changed. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of what he always told young lawyers in his mentoring program: stay calm, stay professional, know your rights. The light turned green, and he proceeded carefully, knowing what was likely coming next. And just as he predicted, the red and blue lights began flashing in his rearview mirror, cutting through the peaceful evening he'd been enjoying. Little did he know, this seemingly routine traffic stop was about to become a moment that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others in ways he couldn't imagine. The young police officer sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he scanned the quiet suburban streets. He'd been on duty for 8 hours already, and the night shift always made him a little edgy. His coffee had gone cold in the cup holder, forgotten during the last routine traffic stop. That's when the black Mercedes caught his eye. Something about it just didn't sit right with him. The car was too nice for this neighborhood. At least, that's what his gut told him. He'd been taught to trust his instincts during his time at the academy, but sometimes those instincts came tangled up with thoughts he didn't like to examine too closely. He started following the Mercedes, keeping a few car lengths back. The driver seemed to notice. They always did, and he watched as the car became almost painfully careful in its movements. Perfect stops at every sign, precise speed limit adherence, turn signals for every lane change. It was the kind of driving that screamed consciousness of being watched. His mind started creating scenarios. Maybe it was a stolen car. Maybe there were drugs involved. He'd made some good arrests this way, earned praise from his sergeant for his proactive policing. But there was always that nagging voice in the back of his mind, the one that sounded suspiciously like his mother's, asking if he was really being fair. The decision came almost automatically. He flipped on his lights, watching as the Mercedes pulled over smoothly and perfectly to the curb. The driver even put on their hazard lights. Textbook behavior that somehow made him more suspicious rather than less. As he called in the stop to dispatch, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Every traffic stop was potentially dangerous. They'd drilled that into him at the academy. His hand instinctively checked his holster as he stepped out of the patrol car, flashlight ready in his other hand. The night air was cool on his face as he approached the vehicle. His boots crunched on loose gravel, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The Mercedes's tinted windows were already rolling down. Another perfect response that somehow set him more on edge. He could see the driver now, a black man in what looked like an expensive suit. The officer's grip tightened slightly on his flashlight. "License and registration," he barked, his voice coming out harder than he'd intended. He didn't mean to sound so aggressive, but something about the situation had him wound tight. The driver's hands moved slowly, deliberately, every movement telegraphed with careful precision. "Of course, officer," came the calm reply, spoken with the kind of educated accent you'd hear on the news. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now." The officer's flashlight beam followed those careful movements, catching the glint of what looked like a gold ring on the driver's hand. The interior of the car was immaculate, with leather seats that probably cost more than the officer made in a month. As the driver reached for his documents, a slight shift in his jacket revealed something that made the officer's heart jump, but it wasn't a weapon. It was the edge of what looked like a federal judge's credentials. The realization hit him like a bucket of cold water. His throat suddenly felt dry, and his earlier suspicions began to curdle into something that felt uncomfortably like shame. But it was what happened next that would change everything, both for him and for the man he pulled over. The judge didn't yell. He didn't threaten to report him. Instead, he did something completely unexpected, something that would set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. And in that moment, on that quiet suburban street, both men stood on the brink of an encounter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about each other. The air felt thick with tension as the police officer's flashlight beam bounced around the car's interior. His stance was rigid, almost aggressive, with one hand still hovering near his gun. The judge noticed all of this with the same careful attention to detail that had served him well in the courtroom for 2 decades. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice carrying that edge of authority that seemed to come too naturally. The judge felt his heart rate quicken, not from fear exactly, but from a deep, weary familiarity with these moments. He'd been here before, too many times to count. "Of course, officer," the judge replied, keeping his voice steady and calm. He'd learned long ago that in these situations, tone was everything. As he reached for the door handle, he made sure to narrate his movements. "I'm opening my door now." Every gesture was slow, deliberate, like a carefully choreographed dance he'd performed countless times before. The streetlight cast long shadows across the pavement as the judge stepped out. He stood tall in his tailored suit, his presence commanding yet non-threatening, a balance he'd mastered over years of similar encounters. The contrast between them was stark. The young officer in his crisp uniform, tense and suspicious, and the older man in his expensive suit, radiating a calm that came from decades of handling difficult situations. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" the judge asked, his words measured and precise. He already knew the answer, of course. It was the same answer it had always been, even if it was never actually spoken aloud. The same reason he'd been stopped outside his own neighborhood last month and the month before that. The officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "You were driving suspiciously," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "This is a high-end vehicle for this neighborhood." As soon as the words left his mouth, something in the officer's expression suggested he knew how that sounded. The judge could feel the familiar weight of this moment pressing down on him. He thought about his son, now in law school, and all the conversations they'd had about moments just like this. He thought about the countless young men who'd stood before his bench, telling similar stories that too often fell on deaf ears. His judicial credentials were still in the officer's hands, and he watched as the young man's eyes kept darting between the badge and his face, reality slowly sinking in. The judge could pinpoint the exact moment when recognition hit. He'd seen that look before, that mix of embarrassment and defensive pride. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the exhaustion from a long day in court, or maybe it was the memory of his son's voice asking why things never seemed to change. Whatever it was, the judge made a decision. This time, the encounter wouldn't end with the usual awkward apology and hasty retreat. "Officer," he said, his voice taking on the same tone he used in his courtroom, "I think we need to have a conversation." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Not as a judge and an officer, but as two people who might learn something from each other tonight. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of crickets and the soft hum of the patrol car's engine. The officer's flashlight beam wavered slightly, then steadied. Everything hung in balance. Years of experience and prejudice, fear and authority, justice and reality, all converging on this one moment. What happened next would surprise them both, setting in motion events that would ripple through their community in ways neither man could have predicted. Because sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from confrontation or conflict, but from those rare moments when two people choose to truly see each other as human beings. The officer stared at the judicial credentials in his hands. And for a moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of trees in the night breeze. His face flushed red, visible even in the dim street lighting. The badge in his hands wasn't just any credential, it was a federal judge's identification, and suddenly everything felt different. "I apologize, Your Honor," the officer stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling like a sandcastle hit by a wave. He started to hand back the credentials, his hands slightly shaky. Just hours ago, he'd been proudly telling his partner about his instincts for spotting suspicious behavior. Now those same instincts felt like a lead weight in his stomach. The judge watched the transformation happening before him. He'd seen it countless times, that moment when authority figures realized who he was and scrambled to backtrack. Usually this was where the encounter ended, with awkward apologies and quick retreats, but something about tonight felt different. "Do you know what I was thinking about when you pulled me over?" the judge asked, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used with young lawyers in his courtroom. "I was thinking about dinner. My wife made pot roast." He paused, letting that simple, human detail sink in. "What were you thinking about when you saw my car?" The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. The expensive car, the upscale neighborhood, the color of the driver's skin, all the assumptions that had led to this moment. "Sir, I was just doing my job," the officer started, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge noticed how young he looked now, without the shield of authority he'd worn moments ago. Probably not much older than his own son. "Your job is to protect and serve," the judge said softly. "Tell me, who were you protecting when you followed my car for 3 blocks? Who were you serving when you approached me with your hand on your weapon?" The questions weren't accusatory. They were asked with the same calm curiosity the judge used to probe witnesses in his courtroom. And just like in court, these questions had a purpose. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around the collar. "I thought," he began, then stopped. The usual explanations felt hollow now, like excuses he'd repeated so many times he'd started believing them without questioning why. "Would you believe," the judge continued, "that I've been stopped 17 times in the past 5 years? Always in nice neighborhoods, always in my own car, always with the same suspicions." He straightened his tie, a habit from court, and added, "And every time the stop ends exactly like this, with recognition, embarrassment, and nothing learned." Something in the officer's expression changed. It wasn't just shame now, there was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the first glimmer of understanding. "I could file a complaint," the judge said, watching the officer's face carefully. "I could make calls, write letters, demand investigations. But tell me, officer, would that change anything? Would it help either of us understand the other better?" The street was quiet now, the patrol car's lights still painting everything in alternating red and blue. But something had shifted in the air between them. What had started as a routine traffic stop was becoming something else, a moment of possibility, a chance for real change. The judge made a decision then, one that would alter both their lives in unexpected ways. Sometimes, he knew, the greatest impact came not from punishment, but from understanding. And understanding began with a conversation. "Let's turn off these lights," the judge suggested, gesturing to the patrol car's flashing beacons that were still painting the street in red and blue. "We're not going anywhere for a while." The officer hesitated for a moment, then walked back to his car. The night returned to its natural darkness, broken only by the steady glow of street lamps. "I have a son about your age," the judge began as the officer returned. "He's in law school now. Want to know what his first legal question was when he was just 10 years old?" He didn't wait for an answer. He asked me if it was legal for police to stop us just because we're black. The officer's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt. The judge leaned slightly against his car, his posture deliberately casual, making this less of a confrontation and more of a conversation. "I didn't have the heart to explain to him that what's legal and what's right aren't always the same thing," the judge continued. "Instead, I taught him how to survive these encounters. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Don't show anger, no matter how justified it might be." A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere far off, a siren wailed. The officer shifted his weight, his discomfort visible. "Sir, I'm not," he started, but the words wouldn't come. "You're not what?" the judge asked gently. "Racist. I believe you. But let me ask you something. Before you saw my credentials, what story had you already written in your head about me? About why I was in this neighborhood? About what might be in my car?" The officer's silence was answer enough. The judge watched understanding slowly dawn on the young man's face, like sunrise breaking through clouds. 3 months ago, the judge continued, I was stopped right outside my own driveway. Last month, it was while driving my wife to her doctor's appointment. 2 weeks ago, I was pulled over taking my grandson to his piano lesson. Each example landed like a quiet hammer blow. Each time, the officer had a reason. Each time, they were professional and polite once they saw who I was. But tell me, why did they need to see who I was to treat me with respect? The night air had grown cooler, but neither man seemed to notice. The officer's earlier defensiveness had melted into something else, not quite shame, but maybe the beginning of awareness. "When I'm on the bench," the judge said, "I see young men who look like my son. Some are guilty, some are innocent. But they all deserve to be judged by their actions, not by assumptions. When you followed my car tonight, what were you really seeing?" The officer looked down at his boots, then back up at the judge. "I was taught to trust my instincts," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Instincts can be trained," the judge replied. "They can also be wrong. The question is, are we willing to examine them?" He straightened up, adjusting his suit jacket. "I could walk away from this encounter angry. I could file complaints, make headlines. But what would that change?" The conversation paused as a car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating both men's faces, one young and increasingly thoughtful, the other older and quietly determined. What happened next would surprise them both, transforming a routine traffic stop into something neither man had expected. The judge looked at his watch. It was nearly 11 p.m. now. His wife's pot roast would be cold, but something more important was happening here. Sometimes, he thought, change comes at unexpected moments in unexpected places. "I have an idea," the judge said, reaching into his pocket. The officer tensed automatically, then caught himself. Another unconscious reaction that didn't go unnoticed by either of them. The judge pulled out a business card, holding it up so it caught the street light. "Come to my courtroom tomorrow." The officer's eyebrows rose in surprise. This wasn't how these encounters usually ended. "Your courtroom?" he asked, confusion clear in his voice. Am I being summoned?" A small smile crossed the judge's face. "No, not a summons. An invitation. I have a full docket tomorrow. Come watch. See what I do. See who comes through those doors." He held out the card. "See the people I serve, all of them." The officer took the card slowly, like someone being handed something both precious and dangerous. His fingers traced over the embossed letters of the courthouse address. "I don't understand," the officer admitted. "Why would you want me there?" "After what just happened." Because what just happened isn't unique, the judge replied. But how we'd handle it could be. He gestured to the quiet street around them. Out here, in the dark, with lights flashing and adrenaline pumping, it's easy to see threats everywhere. Easy to let fear and assumptions drive our actions. A couple walked by on the other side of the street, their quiet laughter carrying in the night air. Both men waited until they passed before continuing. But in my courtroom, the judge continued, we deal with reality, not assumptions. We look at evidence, not stereotypes. We see people as they are, not as we fear they might be. He paused, letting his words sink in. I think you might learn something. And maybe, just maybe, I might learn something too. The officer looked down at the card again, then back at the judge. What time? He asked finally, his voice quieter now, thoughtful. 9 a.m. Tell the bailiff you're my guest. Wear plain clothes. This isn't about uniforms or authority. It's about understanding. The judge straightened his tie. And bring a notebook. You might want to write some things down. Something shifted in the officer's stance, the rigid authority giving way to genuine curiosity. Will anyone know about tonight? That's up to you, the judge replied. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones we choose to learn, not the ones forced upon us. He opened his car door but paused before getting in. One more thing, after court, if you're willing, I'd like you to meet some people. People who might help you see your job and this neighborhood differently. The officer nodded slowly, tucking the card into his shirt pocket. Both men knew this wasn't the end of something, but rather the beginning. Sometimes bridges are built in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people. As the judge prepared to drive away, the officer spoke up one last time. Your Honor, thank you, for not just being angry, for, he struggled to find the right words, for seeing you as more than your uniform, the judge finished for him. Remember that feeling. Tomorrow, I'm going to ask you to do the same for others. The next morning, the officer arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. His police uniform felt like a distant memory as he climbed the courthouse steps, his heart beating a little faster than usual. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, families whispered among themselves, and court officers maintained quiet order. The officer found a seat in the back row, notebook in hand as instructed. He felt strange being here not in uniform, like he was seeing everything through new eyes. The bailiff's voice rang out, all rise. The judge entered wearing his black robes, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he'd shown the night before. But now the officer saw something more. He saw how people looked at the judge, not with fear, but with respect earned through fairness. Case after case came before the bench. A teenager caught stealing, his grandmother in tears beside him. The judge spoke to the boy directly, not with anger but with firm compassion. I see potential in you, he told the young man. Let's not waste it. Instead of jail time, he ordered community service and mentoring. The officer's pen moved across his notebook, seized the person, not just the crime. A landlord tried to evict a single mother of 3. The judge listened carefully to both sides, asked pointed questions about repair records and late payments. His solution was creative, a payment plan that protected both parties. The officer wrote again, finding middle ground. Everyone leaves with dignity. During the lunch break, the judge invited the officer to his chambers. The room was warm with dark wood and filtered sunlight. What are you learning? The judge asked, gesturing to the notebook. I'm learning that every case has a story, the officer replied slowly, and that understanding those stories matters. The afternoon session brought more revelations. A drug possession case came up, the kind the officer had made dozens of arrests for. But watching from this side of the courtroom, he saw more than just a defendant. He saw a person struggling with addiction, a family trying to help, a community affected by every decision. The judge handled each case with the same careful attention, whether it was a traffic violation or a felony charge. He asked questions that went beyond the surface, seeking to understand the why, not just the what. After court adjourned, the judge kept his promise. He introduced the officer to people from the community, a youth-centered director, a reformed ex-convict now mentoring others, a community organizer. Each shared their stories, their challenges, their hopes. The youth director spoke about kids who feared the police instead of trusting them. The ex-convict described how one officer's kindness had changed his life's direction. The community organizer talked about building bridges between law enforcement and neighborhoods. The officer's notebook filled with insights: listen first, ask questions, challenge assumptions, see people, not stereotypes. As evening approached, the officer stood in front of the courthouse, looking back at the building that had just changed his perspective on justice. His phone buzzed, a text from his sergeant asking if he was okay, since he'd taken a personal day so suddenly. He started to type a response, then paused. How could he explain that in one day, watching justice dispensed with wisdom and compassion, he'd learned more about being a good police officer than in years of patrol? The judge's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones we choose to learn. Today, he had chosen to learn, and he knew his next shift would be different. Not because of rules or regulations, but because he was beginning to see his job and his community through new eyes. Back at the police station, things started to change in small but significant ways. The officer who'd spent that day in court began looking at his job differently. His fellow officers noticed it first in the little things: the way he talked to people during traffic stops, how he handled tense situations, his patience with difficult encounters. One morning, during the daily briefing, he raised his hand. His heart was pounding, but he knew he had to speak up. "I'd like to share something that changed the way I police," he said, standing up in front of his colleagues. The room fell quiet. It wasn't often that officers volunteered personal stories during briefings. He told them about that night, about stopping a federal judge, about his assumptions, and how they'd been wrong. He described his day in court, leaving out names but sharing the lessons. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing their own behaviors in his story. "I realized something," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "We talk about protecting and serving, but sometimes we forget to understand who we're protecting and serving." A few heads nodded slightly. Others looked thoughtful. His sergeant, a veteran of 20 years on the force, watched with interest. After the briefing, he called the officer into his office. Instead of the criticism he expected, the sergeant leaned back in his chair and asked, "How do we make this bigger?" That question led to changes nobody expected. The officer started organizing training sessions, not the usual dry presentations about procedures, but real conversations about community relations. He brought in speakers, community leaders, reformed offenders, and yes, even judges, to talk with officers about seeing beyond their assumptions. During one session, a young officer raised his hand. "But what about officer safety?" he asked, voicing the concern everyone had. The question hung in the air for a moment. "Being safe and being respectful aren't opposites," the officer replied, remembering his own transformation. "Understanding the community we serve makes us safer. It makes them trust us more. It makes our job easier." The changes spread beyond training sessions. Officers began spending more time walking their beats, talking to shop owners, playing basketball with kids in the park. Some even volunteered to help at the community center they used to just drive past. The statistics started showing the difference. Complaints against officers dropped. Community tips increased. Even arrest rates changed, not because they were doing their jobs less, but because they were doing them differently. One day, while getting coffee at a local shop, the officer overheard two teenagers talking. "The cops around here are different now," one said. "Like, they actually listen when you talk to them." The officer smiled into his coffee cup, remembering a time when he might have viewed those same teenagers with suspicion. The local news eventually picked up the story, not about that one traffic stop, but about the changes in the department. They interviewed community members who spoke about feeling safer, more respected. They talked to officers who described how building trust had made their jobs more rewarding. During one community meeting, an elderly resident stood up. "I've lived here 40 years, she said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is the first time I felt like the police are really part of our community, not just patrolling it." The officer sat in the back of that meeting, thinking about how one night, one traffic stop, one conversation with a wise judge had started all of this. He thought about how change happens, not always in big, dramatic moments, but in the small choices we make every day. When new officers joined the force now, they entered a department that was different from the one he'd known. They learned from day one that good policing wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about understanding the people they served. A year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The autumn evening was crisp, just like that night, as people filed into the community center's main hall. The room buzzed with an energy that spoke of hope and change. Police officers in casual clothes mingling with residents, kids running around wearing plastic police badges, elderly community members sharing homemade cookies. The judge stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. Next to him stood the officer who'd pulled him over that night, now promoted to community relations supervisor. Together, they'd created something neither had imagined possible during their first encounter, a program that brought police and community members together every month for open dialogue. A year ago, the judge began, his voice carrying across the quiet room. Someone pulled me over on a dark street. He glanced at the officer with a slight smile. What could have been just another confrontation turned into a conversation, and that conversation grew into what we see here today. The room was packed with success stories. There was the teenager who'd been caught shoplifting, now mentored by an officer and headed to college. The elderly woman who'd been afraid to call the police about suspicious activity, now organizing neighborhood watch meetings. The former gang member who worked with officers to prevent youth violence. But the real change, the officer added, stepping up to the microphone, isn't in the programs we've created or the statistics we can show. It's in how we see each other. He paused, looking around the room. We're not just badges and uniforms anymore. We're not just faces in a neighborhood. We're people who share a community. They'd set up discussion tables around the room, each focused on different concerns: youth programs, safety issues, community development. At every table, officers and residents sat together, not as authority figures and civilians, but as neighbors working toward common goals. A young boy raised his hand during the question session. "I used to want to be a police officer," he said, "but my mom told me it was dangerous. Now, I want to be one again because you guys help people." The officer who'd once approached a judge's car with his hand on his weapon now knelt down to the boy's level. "The best part of my job," he said, "is knowing I'm making a difference in my community. And you know what? The community makes a difference in me too." Later that evening, as people were leaving, the judge and the officer stood outside the community center. A patrol car drove by slowly, the officer inside waving to some kids playing basketball in the nearby court. The kids waved back, a simple gesture that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Did you ever imagine," the judge asked, "that one traffic stop would lead to all this?" The officer shook his head. "I was just doing my job that night," he replied. "But you taught me that doing the job right means more than following procedures. It means seeing people, really seeing them." As they walked to their cars, they passed a bulletin board covered with photos from the year's events: community picnics, police youth basketball games, joint volunteer projects. Each image told a story of barriers broken down, of trust built up, of a community healing. "You know what's funny?" the officer said, pausing by his car. "I still patrol that same street where I stopped you. But now, when I drive through at night, I don't look for suspicious behavior. I look for opportunities to connect." The judge smiled. "That's the real change," he said, "not just in what we do, but in how we see the world around us." As they drove away that night, both men knew they'd created something lasting. Not just a program or a partnership, but a new way of thinking about community and justice. One traffic stop had opened a door, and through that door had walked hundreds of people, each carrying their own story of change.